Thank you so much. Well, welcome to this session on financial institutions, net zero and carbon markets. I'm Lisa DeMarco, the chair of the International Emissions Trading Association and CEO of Resilient LLP. I want to introduce our fabulous panel with some context. I'm going to ask them to tell you a little bit about themselves before we get into things, but I have been on the ground in New York Climate Week since early Monday, and this topic has been the buzz of the week. We cannot go to any event without getting specific comments, questions, inquiries, press, media in and around the aspects of the role that financial institutions are playing in the net zero and ongoing financing of both activities that form part of the solution to the Paris Agreement and in carbon markets themselves. So with that, as context, you have an outstanding panel in front of you. And I'm going to ask each and all of Jan Willem and Carrie and Sue to introduce themselves. Sue, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. Thank you to Aida. I'm Susan McGeechee. I am the head of the BMO Climate Institute. The Climate Institute's about a year old, a little over. I'm a year into BMO. Before that, I was at an engineering consulting company working globally on climate change kind of advisory services, leveraging the technical expertise of the engineers. And before that at EY, so management consulting. I started my career in ESG. Ratings and analytics. And I think that, I'll wrap up there.
Carrie.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm Carrie Constabile. I lead net zero and sustainability strategy at Standard Chartered Bank. I have been there for all of 1 month, so I hope you are kind to me and your questions. Previously, so I've had a career in climate science, finance, and policy for the last couple of decades. I started in climate science, in and out of banks and the UN, then joined the Secretary General's office, was part of the Paris Agreement, and managed climate and energy teams, and was part of some of the frameworks that banks report on or align with today. Then joined Google to lead their sustainability strategy, where I was highly involved in a lot of the net zero strategy and led their carbon removals work, and the founding of Frontier, which some of you may know, of high permanent removals. And I recently joined Standard Chartered. So I'm really pleased to discuss what we're doing, and this is a great panel.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I think we also need to mention that one person is missing.
Unfortunately, Robin is not able to be with us today, so he sent his regrets, and I'm sure you will be well served by having these three folks in front of you today.
Thank you. Jan Willem van der Ven, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I'm heading the team on international climate policy. And I'm responsible for what the bank is doing with the COP, with the UNFCCC, but also on climate finance strategy and on carbon markets. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much with that by way of introduction. Let's start with the general and move to the specific. The context has changed a little bit, just a little, over the last year. Starting with the COP, we've really seen enhanced involvement, real significant initiatives coming out of financial institutions in general, in and around both carbon markets and the net zero movement. I'm really curious about what your perspectives are on the key trends, things that have moved over the last year in particular. There's been so much. Do you want to start with Carrie, and we'll move to Sue and then Jan Willem?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. So I think I mean, the race to zero and that whole movement for Glasgow was a huge incentive for corporates and banks, and it's not without nothing's perfect, but it was a huge rallying cry for banks and corporates to at Glasgow, and I think it was also a huge rallying cry in the media, right? It was so there was just a lot more attention on private sector delivery. And declaration of net zero commitments. So I think the momentum is strong. What's very important is, of course, and that's part of the what many of us are talking about this week, is the integrity of those commitments. What is underlying them? Making sure that there is very credible, there's credible data, that there are credible short-term targets in addition to meeting the 2050 or earlier targets if possible. And so that's I think there was a big movement just in terms of getting commitments, and now there's a big movement in terms of really ensuring that those commitments are credible. So that is something that we at Standard Chartered are hugely committed to. We have indicated that we plan to submit our targets to SBTI. We've set out really ambitious targets, especially for our context. So Standard Chartered is an emerging markets bank. 33 out of our 59 markets do not have net zero targets themselves. So you can imagine setting our own targets data was highly imperfect. And so you have to use proxy data, et cetera. It's very difficult. And then it's also a matter of socialization, both within the markets, with the governments with whom we work, and also especially our clients. So I think, what's really important these days, I think, in terms of net zero commitments, is not making the perfect the enemy of the good, holding ourselves to 1.5 aligned trajectories, really getting very refined on the data, getting really refined on the targets, but also knowing that a lot of the data isn't there yet. There's still a lot of guidance that's lacking in terms of hard to abate sectors, et cetera. And then, as we know, and many politicians say often, half of the technologies to even reach net zero don't yet exist. So I think we need to know that there's an imperfect situation, but we still need to push our institutions, push one another to get as rigorous as we can.
Fantastic. Susan, sorry.
Either way is fine. I mean, the biggest trend that really brought me to BMO, and so BMO is Bank of Montreal in Canada, BMO Harris Bank in the US, and we also just acquired a California-based bank focused on Western US. So a lot of interest in this big trend of financing climate solutions across North America. We're very focused on North America. And to me, it's pivotal. It's the banks saying,
Can I just interrupt for you for 1 second? I see so many of you standing at the back. There are 3 or 4 seats here and other spaces. So please come in and feel comfortable for a minute. Don't worry about it. Come forward. Sorry about that, Susan.
no, I mean, the best host, right? Yeah, so it was, how you always heard there's lots of capital, no deals. It was really kind of saying, what, there are these projects and they actually aren't accessing capital, and having the banks say, what can we actually do differently to make that happen? It's not just that you're not bankable and we'll walk away. It's how can we make you bankable? What do we need to learn? What are the different tools that we can leverage that we haven't been leveraging before, which is why BMO did introduce or launch this Climate Institute to really get into those, kind of one-off deals. I heard yesterday something that very much resonated with me on one of the panels, saying, there's always been blended finance. You would know this as Standard Chartered, but it was small and very bespoke. And so banks, in North America certainly weren't interested in small and bespoke. We need to replicate, we need to have it at scale. Well, now we have to actually get our arms around small and bespoke, because we have to learn. We have to go with deal by deal by deal. So one of the tools that I really is relevant, I guess, to this room and what I want to talk about is a long-term offtake carbon revenue stream. And so understanding these markets for us. So really making sure that we can understand the markets in order to support our clients in implementing this financial risk management opportunity, and make the solutions, those climate solutions, financeable where they weren't financeable. So we really kind of embraced how are we going to learn more about the carbon markets in order to engage properly with them. So we joined AIDA so that we could have all of the information on carbon, and also AIDA can facilitate our engagement in the actual market. We also developed a new role, a carbon innovation analyst, to monitor and analyze all of the changing regulatory frameworks, the rules that are just, kind of happening now, and the impact of those rules on our clients. And then the third piece, which is very exciting, we acquired Radical, and we are very much looking forward to their leadership in the bank on the whole carbon strategy, leveraging their services in climate advisory and solutions, as well as credit generation and of course, carbon trading and sales.
Thanks very much. Jan Willem.
Lisa, I have a couple of slides, so
Okay.
maybe you can.
Let's see if we can get some out there.
Can we
We've
get the
got them
slides?
coming
Because,
up, and they're being done by the AV crowd. So
there we are. So first one we can skip. So let's say, so one of the topics is net zero. Let's say, I think, and I just want to illustrate with this slide, there's still a bit of a discussion what net zero means and how we break it down into, let's say, implementation milestones that we can be accountable against. So I think that's the key of this slide. Why? Okay. So EBRD is a multilateral development bank. We operate in Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, Central Asia. And our key role is to engage with the private sector, creating markets and invest across the economies into a host of projects. Now, as we are a public bank, public-owned bank by more than 60 shareholders into countries, including the US, we have been requested to align our operations with the Paris Agreement. So, and that's the big theme also for all of the MDBs. I see a colleague from the World Bank in the back. So we have a very intensive work program together with the other MDBs on aligning, working out the methodologies on how we can kind of underwrite basically our alignment with the Paris Agreement, and in particular the so-called Article 2.1c, which says that financial flows should be aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And this is, I think, a key article, and that's going to transpire eventually also into, over time, into financial regulations for banks, financial institutions across. So we have a work program that works in, looks at the mitigation angle, the adaptation angle, how we can further, let's say, the issue of climate finance, and also how we report against it. How do we measure progress as to this alignment? And I think these are these work programs where processes that will lead to deliverables that we are going to use in our kind of relationships with, for example, banks that we finance in the countries that we operate in. It's a bit slow as to, before I go there, I think it's very good to see, and I think that's a development, to see the financial institutions coming back to the carbon market. They were lost for a little while, but no damage done. And I think it's very good that the two are going along, because a good, let's say, low carbon and resilient project working in a carbon price environment is something that is needed in order for the banks to have an investable project. So the two things should be married. But if you look at all of the standards, and they're popping up everywhere, there's a bit of dissonance still between what is happening as to standardization in the carbon market and the standardization that is happening in the area of climate and sustainable finance. So, for example, EU taxonomy doesn't really reconcile with kind of the carbon trading in the ETS. So I think that discussion needs to further happen as to making sure that if you do that, because both systems need baselines, benchmarks, both systems need MRV. And again, this is a lot of work that still needs to happen. And we can only grow and accelerate if we can scale the market. That's very clear. So I understand the kind of, we started small with our climate finance, but in the meantime, over half of the bank's operations we deem as climate finance, so investment in emission reduction or adaptation projects. And but we can only further grow that if we have also very close cooperation with the private sector on those.
I wonder if we can come back to the specific accounting and disclosure developments, come back to you shortly. And I wanted to, on that big context question, particularly go to Carrie, because we so often, particularly in North America, think of things in the global North and the Westernized world. I wonder if you, Carrie, can speak to the global South and the difficulties that financial institutions and others are facing, or the solutions that you're bringing to bear in relation to the global South and emerging markets. And we'll come back to the specifics.
Yeah, it's a really important point. I think emerging markets, what I'm finding, and having worked in emerging markets through my career, but for the last couple of years really didn't focus on it, is that it's, you know, a lot of the discussions this week are not focused on emerging markets, despite the fact that they are the highest growth in terms of GDP growth, and where energy is increasingly exponentially increasing in terms of demand. In terms of the challenges, I mean, there are many and as I mentioned before, I think we can't make the perfect of the enemy of the good. But as I mentioned, over half of our markets, the markets in which we work, do not have net zero targets and do not and this is not, you know, it's net zero pathways are not, you know, the common discussion on the street or in the markets. You know, in the way that we know that in our worlds, they are. And so there is a process of socialization. Also data, you know, getting good data, getting data at all is challenging. So when you're setting these net zero targets, you first need a really good baseline, and then you need to set your target against those. And if you don't have sufficient data to set that good baseline, it's a guessing game, and that's okay, again, because we, you know, this is a process, this is a journey. We need to do it well and robustly, and so it's going to be imperfect until, you know, as we socialize, et cetera. But the data is a very big challenge. And we published recently an update to our commitments. We moved up our commitments in this past spring, and we you know, we're very transparent about the fact that you know, our baseline is, you know, approximately 45 million tons, but it could go up to 60 million tons depending on the data, and that's a huge delta. So that's important to be transparent about that and to work with our clients and markets to get better data and to all, you know, be you know, try to work with our clients and markets on that 1.5 aligned pathway. I think secondly, it's in Standard Chartered's client base. I mean, we work with very carbon intensive sectors, and the world is carbon intensive, right? That's what we are all trying to change. And so what we really are committed to doing is transitioning those sectors, working with clients to transition their ultimate business trajectories and really accelerate transition finance. So we have committed 300 billion by 2030 in green and transitional finance. We have a new kind of, as I'm calling it, a SWAT team of experts in hard to abate sectors that are specifically working on transition and innovation in CCUS, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, really exciting. And so it's really a hand-in-hand effort with our clients to make that transition. That said, if our clients are not interested in making that transition or are expanding fossil fuels, we've made some statements in our coal statement that if we have some clients that are committed to expanding coal and not interested in going down a net zero trajectory, we will exit those clients, and we have done that for 4 coal clients. So it's a combination of a carrot and stick effort, and it's I can't stress it enough, and this is one of the reasons I personally joined Standard Chartered is the emerging markets are key. If we do not get this right in the markets that that are increasing in infrastructure, increasing in energy infrastructure in particular, there will be a lock-in effect that will last for decades, if not centuries. And so I think that is why this is so important, but it is not, there's no quick answer. It is a process, and it's a mix of carrot and stick.
So a little dose of reality and pragmatism for those of us in the world, in the room, who are used to a very westernized world. So Jan Willem's talking about everything that's going on in the accounting and related standards world. Accounting and disclosure, Sue, what are your thoughts in terms of everything that's been going on this year, and the SEC related disclosures, related accounting standards, the International Sustainable Standards Board, any of the developments? Any thoughts on general trends there or specifics?
Sure. I mean, the lack of data, right? Like that's going to be, it's a huge challenge. So even for us to set our targets, same thing, we wouldn't know if we were measuring progress to those targets. So we can set a net zero aligned target, but then we don't have enough data to know if any measures that we put in place to reduce emissions. Now that doesn't mean we shouldn't put in the measures. We just wouldn't be able to track it. So how do you appropriately report it? I am really excited about the ISSB. I think it's standardizing and requiring what was voluntary for a long time through the TCFD. So the TCFD developed very deliberately to be voluntary. I think that was important because it brought a lot of institutions along, and corporate, right? Like it was one of those it was the one framework, you all know, that actually developed it was developed in collaboration between the issuers and the investors. So everybody agreed, okay, this is a framework that we can all work behind, and the investors weren't just asking issuers for the information they had to report to. So that's partly why it was so successful. Partly it was also the gravitas of the people involved, but it was voluntary, and that enabled people to try it out, to make some mistakes, to engage with the market, to engage with their investors. Now we've got the SEC, and I think one of the challenges with the SEC, also good, it's a good momentum piece, like it's a driver for sure, but you didn't have as much uptake on TCFD in the US. And now all of a sudden you have it mandatory. And so they never, a lot of US companies didn't really have the same chance to, kind of explore and put out some material and maybe make some mistakes. And so now they're instantly worried about liability. And so you're seeing a bit of a backlash on SEC and Net Zero Banking Alliance in the US. To some extent, Canada, although Canada hasn't said that. So I shouldn't, that's my own personal view, not that of the financial institutions, but there's some hesitation now, because if it is a mandatory requirement and some players in North America have not had the same chance to engage with it as a voluntary measure, it becomes very scary. So I think that piece is going to be interesting to watch, and perhaps we dial back. I wonder, I know we were just chatting before the panel about double materiality. I did come from ESG ratings space. I thought it was really an important time. It was 2002 to 2008. I think it was, incredibly exciting. So I don't want to, I think the ESG raters and analytics firms do a great job of bringing transparency to the market and driving change. Double materiality, I'm not sure I understand in terms of we have to really think about, we drove for so long trying to think about how this is material to your future financial performance. And your impact on the environment should be considered material to future financial performance. Now, I understand in the US, it's a kind of a legal issue in terms of, the SEC, the definition of materiality was very much, influencing an investor's decision. So you weren't supposed to include anything that distracted from an investment decision. So pre-2010, you weren't allowed to ask questions as an investor to an issuer. You weren't allowed to ask questions about climate change. That was a rule because it was immaterial to the investment decision. So in 2010, the SEC issued guidance that was changed. Canada did something similar. In Canada, my impression, and I'm not an expert here, so I'm just going to blurt it out, but my impression is that materiality was a bit more softly applied in that it was anything that would influence an investor's decision to invest. And therefore, if the investor wanted to know about the impact on, kind of sacred caves or kind of communities, vulnerable communities, then this was material to them. If we're starting to say that it's double materiality, I think we're actually going to lose a little bit of the momentum that we had built to say that these are material issues to the long-term viability, therefore financial performance of the company.
So we can come back to some of that nitty-gritty. I'm sure we'll have a few questions from the crowd, but we got there because of this fantastic slide that is juxtaposing everything that's going on the standard side with everything that's going on the accounting and reporting and disclosure slides. So I so rudely interrupted you midway through. I'll ask you to continue and to elucidate us, Jan Willem.
Thank you. It's good to discuss and hopefully we get lots of questions. So as I said, we're working hard on the Paris alignment, and one of the things we hope to finalize by this year is our Paris alignment methodology for intermediated finance. So as EBRD, we finance a lot of banks in the countries we operate in, and basically we want to put in a policy statement in our transactions with these banks, so that also over time these banks become Paris aligned, and it's a dialogue, as you said, Kerry. You can say jump, but then the question is how high, and a lot of emerging markets it's not very high at the moment, and that's also because the whole country policy environment, let's say a lot of developing countries don't have a long-term strategy. And without a long-term strategy, you wouldn't know what the remaining carbon budget is in certain sectors. So all kinds of trade-offs between agriculture and forestry, industry, power sector, etc. These type of who gets what, so to say, out of that, and how can you then make an investable case is going to be a very important discussion. So it will take time, lots of time to get the information levels up. But what this slide is showing, that we will, let's say, as to new transactions on bespoke credit lines for energy efficiency and renewables, those will be deemed as Paris aligned per se. But over time, we will work more on the let's say the counterbanks, let's say our relationships as to ensuring that they get a climate strategy, which we call climate governance support that we will give to them, so technical assistance, capacity building, so that they can formulate that and get through their own boards as to decisions. Thank you.
do you have another slide here? Is this?
No, this is the last.
Oh, I'm sorry. One of the elements in terms of the specifics of disclosure and accounting, increasingly this year with developments in the UK and most recently with the concept note coming out of the Article 6.4 supervisory body relates to the difference between removals versus reductions and avoidance and the associated disclosure standards there. Carrie, do you have any thoughts on some of the challenges or the approaches to what we're seeing as a changing approach to accounting and disclosure?
Definitely, many thoughts, and I'm sure many of you have thoughts. I think one of the challenges with meeting net zero is obviously residual emissions, and we wish they didn't exist, but they, as I mentioned earlier, there are many technologies that we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know, and therefore we are all estimating, predicting that we will have residual emissions. The SBTI guidance that has come out and is that to meet net zero, avoided emissions or reductions don't count, and that has caused a lot of consternation amongst many net zero experts. One, because the avoided emissions reductions are incredibly important, and we need to continue to incentivize them. And so, if a standard like SBTI isn't incentivizing them, are we going to lose a really important element of the carbon market? I think Standard Chartered has done a lot on this. We are a leader both in terms of meeting net zero for ourselves, but also enabling net zero for the world. And so that's why we, Bill Winters, our CEO, co-chaired the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, is highly involved in the Integrity Council now, because we really think we need to increase the integrity of the carbon market, and which to date has really focused primarily or largely on reduction in avoided emissions credits. I think and I really liked your slide. I think one of the bodies that was missing there is the VCMI. And so I think what's really interesting what the VCMI is doing, Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative. There's
so many acronyms.
But what they are doing so SBTI, I think by 2050, according to that standard, it's avoided emissions reductions can't count against residual emissions. And in some ways I understand, and from a science perspective, I think there's certainly rationale there. That said, we are not working within any corporate, within any bank. We're not working on a 2050 trajectory. We are working on next quarter, the next quarter, and it's really important to also know that technology-based removals are at a very, very early stage. So it's not like we can go out to the market right now and procure direct air capture credits, for example. There's Climeworks, they're doing amazing work. There's a lot that's happening, but it's very early stage. And so, so what we are, for our own net zero commitment, we are going to be developing a portfolio approach that is combined, reduction, avoided emissions, nature-based solutions, and tech-based solutions where they are today, and we want to incentivize that market. So possibly by 2050, we all will be there in terms of removals, and maybe that, but today and on our pathway, we need a glide path, and so that's really important. I think and we need short-term targets, and that's where I'm excited about VCMI, because VCMI is working with corporates and banks and corporates to align on what short-term pathways that include avoided emissions and reductions are credible. And I think that's where we really need some help from the standards bodies. Is a 2050 trajectory is fine, but what does 1.5 alignment look like next quarter, next year, next 5 years? I think and how do we ensure that the removals push, and there's a huge push, does not create its own carbon market. And there's a big push there. And then having worked closely with a lot of the removals companies, and there is concern that, okay, the carbon markets, there's been a lot of criticism, et cetera. Should we just create our own market? And that is something that we do not, from Standard Chartered, from the ICVCM, we don't think should happen, right? We can learn a lot from the carbon markets. There's a lot of incredible elements of the methodologies, et cetera. And we should include removals, but it shouldn't, again, I hate to repeat myself, but be be the enemy of the good. So I think we really believe in a portfolio approach for the world. And not at the exclusion of incentivizing removals, but making sure that all of it is integrity led, and that we don't discount one for another.
Sure, jump in there. I just want to just clarify a point in terms of the purchase and sale of removals. Fair to say that there have been transactions, but most of them are forward at this point. Is that?
Yes, especially when you're looking at high permanent removals. So of course, if you define removals, and there are different definitions, which also needs to be sorted out, but that if you're looking at removals 1,000-year plus, yes. If you include removals as nature-based solutions, reforestation, avoided deforestation, which some do, then of course that's been taking place for some time.
And Jan Willem, you wanted to jump in there.
Thank you for that. I just want to say how we stand in this. So one of in our Paris alignment work, six
Do you want
work.
to pull back up the graphic? I
Yeah.
really like the graphic if we can.
Well, it was on the second slide. In any case, so we're working heavily on policies and policy dialogue with the countries we work with, and establishing regulated carbon markets or carbon pricing systems is for us the main objective. And that also means that in the Paris alignment question, I still have a big question in how far we can deal with the matter of voluntary credits, particularly if there are no corresponding adjustments, because then I think the ability for us to kind of rely on that is kind of not there, because it's not embedded in the Paris Agreement system as such. So that's a big question that I want to put out there.
So by way of background, we're talking about corresponding adjustments as mandated in association with elements of Paris compliance trading under Article 6 and the related accounting and transparency framework that's mandated. So I know that we're bringing together people of very different levels of knowledge and expertise, and sometimes we're very down in the weeds, and sometimes we're much more general. So with that, I'm going to ask one last general question and then open it up to questions, if that's all right. And each and any of you can comment in relation to a lot of the activity over the last year has been very much stimulated by what's known as the GFANZ process, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that has been a conglomeration of entities adhering to or committing to in some form partner initiatives to the race to zero. And some of those partner initiatives include the Net Zero Banking Alliance, Sue, that I believe you're part of, and Kara, you're part of, the Net Zero Asset Owners Initiative, Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, and there are insurance alliances that are along the same entities. And there's been a burst of activity, not without some challenges. So do any of you want to talk to that in any more detail?
So do you mind if I just quickly talk about removals, and maybe I'll put it in the
Please,
context
please.
of GFANZ. So BMO did pre-purchase 1,000 carbon removal units from it was B0 and Carbon Engineering. So Carbon Engineering is a direct air capture company. And the reason we did it, I mean, because that was our own operational footprint, and like those are $400 credits. So we didn't need to spend that amount. The reason we did it is because we wanted to accelerate the market. So we wanted to play a role, and we have that strategy. So our carbon trading strategy that we're setting up within the broader environmental commodities trading strategy is about being able to pre-purchase carbon credits, and I will get to offsets in a second because those are important too. So that we can support, as I said at the very beginning, we need to create these revenue streams, these guaranteed revenue streams. So what can we do as BMO? Partly it could be for our own operational footprint, partly it can be for a trading desk, partly it can be support to our clients and they can purchase directly. So we just want to make sure that we see those revenue streams, and on the offset side, where there are still, we're looking at these decarbonization roadmaps, I guess, or pathways by sector. What is feasible? If we look at, say, cement, our preliminary analysis in the Climate Institute, and we've been supported by Wood Mackenzie, we can decarbonize to a certain level, and then we need the removals. Within some of these other, kind of pathways, there seems to still be room on a net zero pathway for offsets. And so where those solutions do require that additional, they have the additionality component, they require the income from carbon offsets to move forward, then 100% we want to be a part of that. We want to engage with those companies. Obviously, we don't want to get onto a pathway where the investment only goes so far, and then we're stuck in these systems that can't get to net zero. It can only get to so much of a level of reduction. We want to get beyond the pathway for net zero, but we do believe that some of these technologies still require the income generating opportunity that carbon credits provide, and that would be some of the avoided emissions. So we want to play a part there. If I put all of that into GFANS and the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we are a part of that. We have committed to be our client's lead partner in the transition to net zero. So that's our strategy. We will get our emissions from our lending portfolio to net zero. In order to do that, we have to help our clients and our lending portfolios get to net zero. And so what are the strategies, which is why we're undertaking all of this analysis to see what should our clients be investing in? What is that sectoral roadmap? Is it scientifically and technologically credible? Because if our clients are going into a direction that it would be a pathway to reduction, but not net zero, we want to be able to advise them on this and support them in any financing capacity that we can. I mean, that's our role, where we finance.
Does anyone else want to make any comment before we go out to questions at all? There we go. Andrea, ask a question. You're going to have to use mine, I think. Or shout.
Problem of data and so picking that up also with urgency. So you think about the problem of data and the fact that corporates, as you say, still need to commit to the net zero targets. They still need to build decarbonizing pathways. They still need to make their interim commitments if they're doing all of that fragile data. So I just want to ask your view on if there isn't a use case for carbon credits in helping companies almost as a safety valve to ensure that they're able to stay on that pathway every year as data moves around, as uncertainties happen, like war, helping it implement decarbonizing strategies. Carbon credits not be a safety valve to ensure they keep on that path with safeguards and checks and balances in place.
So the question was on data and the lack of data and the use of carbon credits to fill that gap in the short term.
And it's an interesting idea. I think I would say partially. So there is, I mean, there are a lot of solutions for the data gap, and one is working with clients on just understanding the supply chain, and I think that's where carbon credits could probably play a part. I also think we've got to make, be much more technologically savvy in terms of what we offer to make this easier. So I think, and that's where I think it may be a combination. I think I'd have to think about how carbon credits I mean, maybe there's a blockchain element and, I mean, I think it's more of the transparency. If, depending on the transparency, that's where it could improve the data challenge and unlock. But I think there are also some technological solutions. So there's some things like normative. I don't know if you've looked at Carbon Trace, but there are some interesting new platforms, a partnership between Microsoft and McKinsey that are trying to tackle this for scope 3 and really to overlay, client or business data with satellite informed data so that you can actually visualize where a supply chain is. And then you can, with that information, then provide to clients like, you have this number, it looks like, it actually may be this number based on, our overlay. Can we marry that? So I think it's more broad role, at least initially, without having thought much about the carbon credit dimension of really providing that tech enhanced and satellite informed data overlay that I think can help. It's not going to solve it all, but I think that will help. And then I think that on that element, I'd like to think more about it and talk more about it with you to find solutions. I think there's a there. I just don't even know exactly what it is.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I agree. No, I think we have done in past, we looked at things like internal carbon pricing of companies, and then you see such a widespread as to you use the carbon price that works for you type of thing. So there's no real test in the real economy. So if there's even if there's a voluntary market, a carbon price, then there's at least a reference point that is very useful. Then also for CFOs and so on to go back into the organization and say, I need that data and accelerate these administrative processes that are needed to produce the data.
I would 100% agree as well, because that's a part of the strategy that we're trying to leverage in terms of the carbon market. So if we can measure, it gives our clients an incentive, and I like your idea about the supply chain too. So bigger clients can work with their supply chains to do this. The smaller companies, you measure the emissions reduced or avoided for the credits. You have to put that into that system to generate the credits, and then you now have access to data that we didn't have before. So that's an ambition of our climate strategy.
Time for one more question. Corinne. Why don't you shout it and I'll repeat it.
Just a general question, because I'm a very optimistic person about all of this. Really, we're at a point where being in this market for 30 years, we're at a point where we can actually do this and make it work. I just sort of got the sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that it seems to be moving away from the market structure that's been developing massively over the last, 5 to 10 years, specifically the last 2, like where I work for Air Carbon Exchange, we're blockchain based, we believe in transparency, efficiency, growing the market. But I seem to get a sense where you're talking about something different. And maybe the carbon market will help us, but we have to remember that we're all in this together as markets, as data, as research, as removals, and we don't figure out how to bring it all together. We're never going to get to net zero. You're never going to get there with your data, because you need the markets, and we're never going to get there with just the markets without your data. So I wonder how we can have a discussion more about collaboration as opposed to Susan, you saying we're going to maybe use the markets, and markets might be good for the supply chain, but we really have to develop this together. And I guess maybe I'm wrong, but I'm hoping you can comment. So
I'm going to really quickly say that
one
I'm
second,
definitely moving on the.
I'm going to repeat the question if I can. So the question was, are you as financial institutions moving away from the carbon markets per se? And secondly, are we looking at a distinction between disclosure and related obligations and market activity? So sorry, Sue, I interrupted.
Oh, I would, yeah, well, I guess, thank you for the reframing, Lisa, because I wonder if I'm misunderstanding or not communicating as well. Because I mean, obviously we want to use the markets to make this happen. Like to me, they were interchangeable. I mean, so our whole strategy is based on the fact that there needs to be a functioning market. So that's all I was going going to say, and I don't know. It's an interesting question if we're maybe just, kind of, yeah, I don't.
If I can intervene from it, we are seeing a distinction between the accounting push and the precision and prescriptiveness and harmonization that's required in that, as opposed to the creativity and the breadth and the benefits of market-based activity that I understood everybody to be embracing. I'm not sure if I've got that right, though. Why don't you comment further?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think just to clarify on the data point, the question was really, does the carbon market help to solve the lack of data or the credibility or the validity of data, like data on emissions of clients in emerging markets? And I say partially, you need a lot to solve data. But as I mentioned earlier, data is one piece of this very, very big puzzle. And we fully, I mean, this is why we're extremely involved in the Integrity Council for Carbon Market, voluntary carbon markets. We are, as Standard Chartered and personally, and very committed to bringing the market together. And I think one of my concerns that I've seen in the field is that there is this effort to try to disaggregate. There are some discussions of, can we have a removals market that is separate from avoided emissions? And no, that shouldn't, I mean, I don't like that. We need one market. The market has been, has a lot of benefits. Yes, there are things that haven't worked. Okay, that is because it is a relatively new market in this world and it is improving. And so, and what, why we have the Integrity Council is to ensure that integrity is the baseline and that we make sure that there are checks and balances, et cetera. But it shouldn't be that one credit is on a different exchange. And I mean, that we're different, has different sets of principles, and the principles remain the same for removals and avoided emissions, additionality, no double counting. It's not different. And so that's where we're really pushing for everything to come under the integrity principles, under ICVCM, really have core carbon principles that apply to the entire market. And we're developing, exchanges to help the market, the climate impact exchange, et cetera. So fully aligned. And I think as we need to get very clear on that. So thank you for that, for asking, because we need to be as clear as possible.
So a big call out for integrity and non-fragmentation of markets. Last word, Jan Willem.
Yeah, maybe best to go by an example. I will not mention the country, but we are hugely supportive of creating carbon markets, and let's say, and therefore that the price signal is helping us to find projects that are financeable. But in that one country, we have a host of voluntary standards. They're going to implement an emissions trading scheme. They also need to deal with Corsia, and it's a mess. Yeah, so there is no integrity into the system. So let's say if a country adopts a blockchain type of methodology or accounting system, perfect, no problem with that. But it all needs to stack up, and that's I think the kind of policy dialogue that the MDBs can play also in cooperation with other parties.
I see consistency in these points, push for integrity, noting that we're at the early stage of some of the development of that integrity in the global south, and a push for non-fragmentation. So we're eventually all converging on a similar solution. Any 2-second last comments, a minute or less, any wrap up things you'd like to say?
So I would just repeat: non-fragmentation, data integrity, availability, making sure that nothing is perfect at the end of the good. We need these pledges to be robust. We need to understand that they're a journey. We need them to be data driven, integrity driven, and we're not there today, but we need to push one another to get there as quickly as possible.
And if I can just circle back to the first point, banks need to learn. So we've taken those steps so that we can increase our learning.
We all come to this with humility, ongoing. The more you know you don't know. So with that point of grave humility, mine the greatest, I have to say, thank you so much for attending this session. Your participation has been fantastic.
Just a question. I think that's like
I follow you on LinkedIn. So it's great presentation. Now with their carbon. I was a pastor for many, many years. Blockchain-based carbon trading. Yeah. You know what? I've got you on LinkedIn. I'll give you a card to show on the now. Thank you very much. Oh, I was, if you don't mind, I'll give you a card. We're a pressure market.
we don't get working. Our board is looking into
You mentioned very interesting because like the main fund where they're creating securities and we do a lot of the Middle East. So there are a lot of people trying to put in like that some type of project that's close to the market. And they're not finding yeah, I know.
Okay.
Nowhere else.
Thank you. It's also